Welcome to Sputnik Orbiting the World with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Pulitzer Prize winner Chris Hedges has been many things. Frontline reporter in wars throughout the world. For the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, who had to give me a lot of money once, and others.
He was a speechwriter for independent presidential candidate Ralph Nader, a student, aren't we all, of Professor Noam Chomsky, and is the author of some of the finest books on the planet. On top of all that, he's a visiting professor at Princeton. He's married to a Chinese-Canadian actress of note. He's the father of 4 children. And on Sundays, he's an ordained Presbyterian minister. I'm glad to say Chris Hedges joins us now. Where I come from, a Presbyterian minister doesn't speak like you, except in this regard. And this is, I think, a difference, a political difference between us. The Presbyterian minister in Scotland is famous for saying, we're all doomed. I sometimes get that feeling listening to you speak.
I remain kind of rooted in Calvin. I have a very dark view of human nature, not surprisingly, having spent 2 decades covering wars in Central America. It was 5 years in El Salvador, the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans. I think because of perhaps my theological background or religious background coupled with my experiences, I come down on the dark side of...
But do you think we're predestined to be doomed? Can we change that? I realize that's a theological as well as a political question, and we've only got 12 and a half minutes, but it would be important to avoid the impression that there's nothing we can do to avoid the kind of apocalypse that you paint in your wonderful books and in your wonderful speeches.
Well, no, I mean, I think the reason that there is stuff that we can do, but as Max Weber pointed out, in politics as a vocation, it's a constant battle. We're never going to achieve a state, I mean, and this is Weber's argument, which I think is correct, where finally we put an enlightened system in place, and as Weber argues correctly, the moment you turn your back, all the swamp creatures like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump come back. So it's a constant struggle, and it is a constant struggle on the part of those the elites would oppress to remain organized, to pit power against power.
When you speak of Donald Trump and we speak of the doom scenario, you describe Donald Trump as sort of a cult leader, and cults are only obsessed with themselves and out for destruction.
Yeah.
Right, rather than creation and reservation.
So, I mean, I think that's an important point. I think that we've got to stop looking at Trump as a political leader, because when you define Trump as a cult leader, then the rules are different. So, for example, cult followers of a cult leader want their cult leader to be omnipotent, because the projection of the power of the cult leader becomes through their relationship, which is personal to or they feel it's personal to the cult leader, a projection of their own power. So Trump's misogyny and abuse, I mean, we have a president who is openly paying off porn stars $130,000 and Playboy models or whatever they're called. All the old rules don't apply. He flagrantly violates the rule of law. He lies obsessively. And I think we have to begin to look at those lies, again, as a cult leader does. You lie in the face of reality. I mean, I think he was in Britain saying he had a 94% approval rating. And that also becomes a projection of power, because reality itself doesn't matter.
And yet, the Democrats contrived to put up against him at the last presidential election, possibly the only person in America who could have lost an election to him. What's the guarantee they're not going to do that again?
Well, they are doing it again. That's called Joe Biden. And it just shows how out of touch the Democratic leadership is. And there's a huge section of labor still beholden to Tony Blair that I would argue is the same. They don't grasp that the ideology of neoliberalism has no credibility across the political spectrum. And they think they can throw out a Biden just as they threw out a Clinton, and the old rules still apply. They haven't figured out that they don't.
So you think Trump could get a second term?
I think if Biden is the candidate and the Democratic Party establishment, I mean, we already know they're meeting. All the Wall Street financiers of the Democratic Party have given a list of three. That's Warren, Sanders, and Harris that are a no. And the only, it's early, and unfortunately these are endless charades, but Sanders is probably the only candidate that might be able to challenge.
You and I were both talking an event on imperialism in London this week. I quoted George Orwell from Burmese Days. What is imperialism? A young woman asks him. It's going to other people's countries and stealing their things, which I think is a pretty good definition myself. But what does imperialism mean to you at the end of the second decade of the 21st century?
Yeah, I would only add stealing their things and killing anyone who gets in the way. In genocide is a fundamental component of imperialism. It's interesting, having spent 20 years of my life on the outer reaches of empire and watching how imperialism works. Imperialism is really the expression outside of the borders of your own country of white supremacy and the deep disdain for democracy. So when you read Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War and the collapse of Athenian democracy, he writes that the tyranny Athens, the Athenian Empire, imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. And that's what happens. So when empires, and they always rot from the inside, that's how you vomit up a figure like Trump. Trump doesn't come out of a functional democracy, a functional system, any more than Slobodan Milosevic would have come out of, or Franjo Tuđman and the breakup of Yugoslavia, and go back to Weimar. So, what happens is that they hollow the empire out from the inside. And if you've traveled across the United States, our bridges are collapsing, our public libraries are closed. An oligarchic elite controls all of the wealth and lives, as in developing countries, in these tiny kind of enclaves, while the rest of the country struggles with unemployment and underemployment and at a subsistence level. And so you bring back the tools of empire: militarized police, wholesale surveillance, drones, and an evisceration of civil liberties, whether that's due process or habeas corpus, which we have inflicted now on poor people of color left in what Malcolm X called internal colonies, these deindustrialized pockets. So the terror of, and terror is the right word, 3.3 people a day in the United States are shot dead by police, almost all poor people of color and unarmed. So the terror that is carried out by militarized policed units in these internal colonies, coupled with two other factors: mass incarceration. We have 25% of the world's prison population. We are 5%. I teach in a prison and have for 10 years through Rutgers University. 94% of these people never even get a jury trial. Yeah. They're just railroaded into these prisons. That is a form of social control. And the other form of social control that's often overlooked is evictions. So you lock up the men, largely, and you evict the women and children. And by evicting them every few months, because they can't pay the rents of these slum landlords, you destroy any cohesion within the community. And that people say the system doesn't work. I say, no. The system works just the way it's designed to work.
There is a difference between this empire and previous. The previous empires had not the means of ending life on the planet. This empire does and might. As we speak, there are unfolding dramatic events in the Persian Gulf. The possibility of literally extinction is something that you presage in some of your work. Tell us why you feel that.
Well, you're right to point that out, but also climate change. I mean, we have probably a decade left. What are we at? 400 and something parts per million. I mean, if we don't stop this, I mean, all the science is unequivocal. We're going to talk about the destruction of the ecosystem that sustains life, and what's happening in the hands of the oligarchic elites and the fossil fuel industry. And let's not forget the defense industry. I mean, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases is the U.S. military. You had Obama, who paid lip service to the climate catastrophe, but drilled like Sarah Palin, was a huge friend of the fossil fuel industry. Or you have Trump that pretends that it's junk science or it's not real. But the cumulative effect is the same, which is that for short-term profit, these psychopaths who run these corporations are hurting us all over a cliff.
You have 4 children, I have 5. Are their children going to have a world to live in your view?
Not unless we, and I don't use this word lightly, overthrow corporate power. Otherwise, it's very clear that these people will kill us. And they, if you want to talk about crimes against humanity, and James Hansen, the great climate scientist in the United States, has used that phrase to describe the fossil fuel industry, that will make anything that Stalin or Mao or Hitler or anyone else look like child's play.
Earlier this week, the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, who was a candidate in the Conservative leadership election at the time, signed the extradition warrant for Julian Assange. How will he fare in the courts of the United States if, God forbid, he ends up there?
It'll be a show trial, a kangaroo court. They have all sorts of judicial measures so that he won't even see the evidence against him. We know from the quote-unquote terrorism cases, and I've been very active in some of those, the methods that they use, prolonged solitary confinement, often upwards of 2 years, with using psychological torture to turn people into zombies. I mean, I'm sorry, but Belmarsh Prison has probably already begun that process, although on a smaller scale that was begun in the Ecuadorian embassy, especially under Lenin Moreno. He will have a hood put over his head, put on a black flight. The idea, the special rapporteur on torture, I think is correct, Niels Melzer. I went to the trial of Chelsea Manning, the court-martial of Chelsea Manning. It's farce, but it's very dangerous because it sets a legal precedent, which will now be writ large. Not only will it become impossible, and I speak as a former reporter for the New York Times who did publish classified information. We've already shut down our whistleblowers through wholesale surveillance and in the United States through the Espionage Act. And the last redoubt are the people who can leak and publishers with the courage like Julian to publish. But it will become criminalized. And not only that, because let's never forget that Julian is not an American citizen. WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication, but this will allow the empire to essentially grab anyone, anywhere in the world, and seize them for shining a light into the inner workings of power. And that's why I came to London for Julian's hearing and to publicize this event. That's why, as a journalist, I find it terrifying.
Well, your books are a must-read for anyone interested in these matters, but I'm glad finally to have met you.
Thanks,
Chris Hedges, thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Coming up next, political prisoners. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Sputnik. If Irish republicanism had royalty, our next guest would be in it. Both of his grandfathers fought in the Irish War of Independence. 3 of his brothers were killed in the Troubles, and his sister was described by Scotland Yard as possibly the most dangerous woman terrorist in Britain. And he was just hours from death as an IRA hunger striker when the leadership called off the strike.
Nowadays, he's a journalist and a trade union organiser, and he's in London putting his experience as a political prisoner at the service of the campaign to free Julian Assange. He's Tommy McKerney, and he joins us now. Tommy, welcome on board the Sputnik.
Thank you.
Let's start with Julian Assange first. There he is in Belmarsh Prison, the maximum security prison in Britain, mixing with all sorts. And his health, by all accounts, is not good. You were a political prisoner for many years, 16 years behind bars, 53 days on hunger strike, just hours from death, as Gayatri said. Take us inside prison walls, if you would. What will life be like for a political prisoner like Julian Assange?
Well, let's keep in mind that Julian Assange does not have the bond of comradeship that I would have had. No matter how difficult the time would have been for me when I was in prison, I was surrounded by very good friends and solid comrades who could always help one psychologically, if nothing else, through the darkest of days. Unfortunately, in the case of Julian Assange, this man is a political prisoner without that bond of comradeship. He will be surrounded by people who have no empathy for him at all. And I would not be surprised if there's a deliberate policy, in light of how he has been mistreated and the deliberate attempt to sabotage his good work by the British state, that they would surround him by far-right types, and they are easily identified and identifiable within the prison system. So you could even be in physical danger.
I don't have the experience of the British state that you do. In fact, for nearly 30 years, I sat in its parliament. I'm surprised that the British have incarcerated him there. It would have been just as easy to put him somewhere nicer, in quotes, to treat him better, not to lay themselves open to the charge that they are medically and even in terms of access to visitors and his legal team, open to the reputational damage of treating him badly. After all, it's their intention to deport him, to extradite him anyway. So, in a way, why add to the black marks on your record?
Well, there's an element of this where the leopard doesn't change its spots. Legendarily, in Irish republicanism, we have a huge figure, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. And in the 1860s, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa was held in prison here in Britain, and with spectacularly evil conditions, because he too was a journalist who had highlighted the role of Britain in Ireland. Bear in mind, this was only 20 years after the Great Hunger. So this isn't out of character for the British state. It has a long history of this type of behaviour. But my understanding is that because Julian Assange is a journalist who is effectively only guilty of exposing the mispractice, the malpractice of the United States and its allies here in Britain, that, let's take it this way, if the British people were to be aware of the full facts of this, I would have confidence that the British people would take the right decision and leave the man free. But the British system has now to convince the population, has to convince the world that he is a mere criminal. And that's one of the reasons he's in prison, and it's one of the reasons why he will be, if they can at all, mistreat the guy, possibly hoping that he will have a breakdown.
That's exactly the criminalisation which you and your fellows were on the hunger strike,
Sure.
the blanket before, the dirty protest before, about. When you look at the indictment against Julian Assange, 17 counts, with more in the pipeline, because otherwise they could not be holding Chelsea Manning if the grand jury had already done its work and disbanded. Then her refusal to testify could not keep her in prison.
Sure.
So there must be more. But any reading of the 17 makes it clear that Assange is a political prisoner. These are political charges, aren't they?
And yet, an institution as Amnesty International wouldn't accept that.
Well, it's to the profound shame of Amnesty International, and they're not alone on the so-called liberal left, or distancing themselves from Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, people who have exposed the corruption and the actual evil of what has been happening. And this is where we have to hold the press, well, allegedly the free press, to account. Why has the press Why has the media ignored the case?
There are no laws necessary. It's not a conspiracy. There's not a convention of newspaper owners meeting somewhere in a tax haven, deciding what they will cover and what they won't cover. It's instinctive, isn't it? And what Francis Bacon, describing self-censorship as the arrow that flies in the night, in other words, you don't see it, but it's a deadly arrow nonetheless, isn't it?
It's the most effective form of censorship when it's self-censorship. And it's a process that is, as you rightly identify, there is no requirement to have a conspiracy in some tax haven. But keep in mind that we have a privatised media to a large extent, or a state-run media, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and or the privately owned media, which is owned by incredibly wealthy people. Now, it's not in their interests to have the machinations of the deep state, with which they're closely involved, exposed to scrutiny. So they have a vested interest in maintaining the current system that exists. So why would they?
But there is a paradox, because many of the biggest names in newspapers plastered Julian Assange's revelations on their front pages and have conveniently forgotten now. I mean, if Julian Assange is guilty, they're also guilty, because they actually slapped on their front pages and sold a lot of newspapers on these stories.
Well, of course, and you're right to say sell a lot of newspapers. And then it comes down to the bottom line. It's what is the level of profit and loss. While it sells the newspapers, yes, there's a calculation being made that that's useful. But once it actually challenges the overall system of profit making, not only for the newspapers, but for their allies in the upper echelons of capitalist society, then they will step back. They have no loyalty to their sources. These people have loyalty only to the source of their power, their huge financial power. And keep in mind that the media itself is one of the huge pillars of this corrupt society that is based on the 1%.
The fourth estate. Lastly, a lot of people came to the two meetings about Julian that you spoke at, I spoke at, you did both of them. Hundreds of people came. And many thousands watched online, but the usual suspects were not there. The traditional left, the traditional anti-imperialists, the anti-war movement, the trade unions, were all really conspicuous by their absence. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I wish I knew. This has been a feature of British society for far too long, that those that have the ability to call order don't do so. But I still say, when I looked at the turnout we had on Tuesday night, the turnout we had on Wednesday night, we were looking at what I would describe as ordinary, decent British people. And I always have this view that this is the great fear of the deep state and the power brokers, the ruling class in Britain, is the decency of the British people when they know. And I think we have to look past those that have a vested interest in maintaining society as it stands, albeit possibly with a few minor adjustments. But the ordinary, decent, working class person has an acute awareness of where justice lies. And I think if we can take anything from this, if we are to hold on to optimism, it's that we know that if working people in this country are made aware of what's happening, and they have taken a decent stand often in the past, we are not short of examples, from Tall Puddle through to those that defended the Birmingham Six, that there is a decency in this country if the people can find it out, if they're let to know about it. And in this case, I have to compliment your good self and you for holding the line and doing that against incredible odds. I dread to think where we would be if we didn't have facilities like yourselves.
Tommy McKernie, a pleasure to have you on board the Sputnik.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
So in his first novel, Burmese Days, George Orwell describes imperialism as going to other people's countries and stealing their things. So we asked, what's the definition of imperialism in the 21st century? And Ryan says Orwell's definition is a seminal one, still applicable and relevant as ever today. However, imperialism is now branded as spreading democracy. And
Humanitarian intervention.
Exactly. And Man in the Shed says taking things from countries and then bombing them as a thank you. And Spaceman says dumping our toxic waste and rubbish in the countries after we finish with whatever we stole.
Not a bad set of definitions.
Not bad, is it? Well, that's all the time we've got for the tweets today.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on our social media, Twitter and Instagram, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.